What if I told you there was another Berserk story? What if I told you fresh new summer children that there was another Berserk story spin-off that you actually didn't know about? You thought Berserk was pure and was not subject to spin-offs? Oh my. What if I told you that there was a story about a certain apostle that maybe you or maybe not know about, but you should know about because the fact that he is in one of the best arcs of the story, and there's another book about him. And it was written by the same man who wrote and scripted the very infamous, critically acclaimed Berserk 2016-2017 anime. You'd probably say, get that shit away from me. So I've read it for you, so you don't have to. Let's talk about it. So to start off, Berserk, the Flame Dragon Knight, follows Grunbeld, the Apostle, right? You remember him, the big dragon, the one that Guts fought near Flora's house. A very infamous scene, very top tier cool scene. You may think there isn't a lot to Grunbeld besides just being this huge hulking dragon-like being with just the urge to fight and serve and just get lost in battle. That is all true. He is all these things, plus in the Berserk PS2 game, as personal experience can tell you, he is a fucking terrible boss to fight. He's not bullshit. He just takes forever to fucking kill. And I wish I never have to go through that again. I don't ever want to go through that again. I don't want to fight him. It was fucking terrible. Fuck you, Grunbeld. Anyway, I'm getting off track. Regardless, there is this book that was published in 2017 and later published in 2019 for the English translations for the rest of the world. It was actually overseen by Kentaro Miura and written by Makoto Fukami, who is known as a filmmaker, a manga artist, a novelist, and a screenwriter. So he's an all-around creative guy. Let me tell you, going into this, I knew the reputation this book has. If you haven't heard of this book, let me just give you the rundown of the reputation. And this is from my perspective of being amongst the subreddit and Twitter. Most people heavily hate this book. Heavily hate it. Almost on the same level as 2016-2017 anime. And going in, I knew it wasn't too big of a book. I mean, look at it. It's very small, and I was thinking I will smash this out in a day. Little did I know going in, nowhere did it mention at all that this was what the normies call a novel. It's a novel. I thought it was a manga because it's Berserk. No, it's a novel. I did not know this until I had it in my hands. When I flipped through pages and realized, oh, it's all words. To which, it's okay. I have those things. I just wasn't prepared. I thought this would be a quick, easy dig, a quick, easy dive into a Berserk property. No siree, no siree. How I accidentally read a novel. But enough of that, I got into it, I started reading. Now, to give you a basic premise, and I will be getting to spoilers later on, but just to start, because if you're interested, the novel follows Grunbeld in his life. It talks about where he grew up, his childhood, his family, and his upbringing, and his eventual title of the Flame Dragon Knight. Now, I haven't done too much research as into why this novel was created. I think it was created after the 2016 anime. I think they were publishing it around the time of the 2017 anime, maybe to generate some hype about it, get people interested. Don't know why they could do that. But it's something pretty short. It has a prologue, it has an epilogue, and it has 4 chapters. But despite actually it being a novel, there is original artwork drawn by Kentaro Miura inside the book. Because when they're talking and describing certain things, they thought, hey, let's also just show them what these characters look like so that the reader does have a very specific view and look of these characters, which is really cool. So props to Kentaro Miura for doing that. But it's interesting to read a piece of fiction based in the same world as Berserk, but not be written by Kentaro Miura himself. I understand he was probably, someone who supervised part of it, maybe. Of course, he was very busy, but he did illustrate every panel that was going to be in the story. So he knew the context of what was being written. He had to have read it to then give it the green light, or at least be like, yeah, I can draw that. But the story primarily follows Grunbeld from an omniscient POV. We don't follow technically everything through his POV. We dodge around different POVs of different characters. Now, before I get into the spoiler stuff, I will just say in terms of the vibes and how it presents itself as a novel versus a manga, because they're very different. One of the things that I found was very interesting about reading it in a novel format is that it felt less like Berserk, but still very dark fantasy. There were things that I was reading that was like, that's very consistent as to the world in which Berserk is. And I think mostly because it wasn't a manga, I didn't really feel like it was the same because I couldn't see the visual aesthetics that implied this is a Berserk world. There were moments when something gruesome was being described to me. That is when I started thinking, oh, this reads like a Song of Ice and Fire, which is a very typical dark fantasy comparison to make, but it was one that I can instantly think of when I read this. When I read Berserk actual manga volumes, I know it because I can see it. I'm like, oh, this is very different. I would say when you're reading this, it feels more like a Song of Ice and Fire story than it does a Berserk one. I guess it's also because you can't really visualize characters too much besides the panels you're shown, and they're there to show and remind you that this is in the same world because the writing can't evoke that same feeling as much as the visuals and how good they are. So that's one thing that wasn't really criticism. I gotta say, they do a very good job of describing the violence, describing the action that happens, especially when describing Grunbeld swinging his hammer through rows of soldiers. And it's very satisfying to hear it. I would say there are a couple times when they use the same words continuously, which I think as a novelist or a screenwriter, that's not really great. You need to be giving me different ways to experience and really understand what he's saying. But again, the panels are there to make me go, oh shit. Gives this novel a bit more of an edge than a common novel. If this wasn't a Berserk novel, I don't think I'd be that intrigued. It just feels like a dark fantasy wannabe, if you know what I mean. But besides, in terms of the writing feels very consistent. It feels like it was telling me the story in a way that made sense. I was never really confused, unless at the beginning, because we weren't following Grunbeld from the very start in the prologue. But as time went on, similar to the Black Swordsman arc, you're like, oh, I understand the prologue now. It makes more sense, which I'd say give it a thumbs up for that. I'm very happy about, giving me the setup and giving me the definite payoff of what that meant. I completely forgot about that until it was referenced again. In terms of how it is written, there are a lot of typos. I counted at least 10, which I'd say for a novel that has like 194 pages, that's too much. I'd say it needed to be proofread. Maybe it's just my copy that I got. I don't know, but there were a couple typos. The panels were great. They're few and far between. There aren't that many. I think there's maybe 10 in max. So you shouldn't expect there to be panels in every chapter you read. You shouldn't expect that. You should expect a novel and a descriptive way. I do think that in terms of trying to portray the dark events, the novel did help because there were some things that they described that I don't think would have worked even in Miura's dark world would have worked visually or made sense. It did make more sense to be in written format so you can just imagine what it is you're looking at. But let's get into the real story and look at the comparisons, because Flame Dragon Knight shares a similar story to an arc we all know and love, Golden Age. The way it begins is Grunbeld is growing up in his region of the world, right? Very far from where it is that the rest of the world is happening, the 100-Year War and all that sort of stuff. But in his life, since childhood, there is the oppressive forces of Tudor. Now, Tudor, in this translation, is the army that is fighting the Band of the Hawk in the Golden Age at Doldry. In that one, at least the one I read, it was translated to Tudor, CH. So when I reference Tudor, it's those same guys, because they're trying to conquer most of the known world. Now in Grunbeld's life, his background and life is very similar to that of a Norway Viking kind of vibe. He has people who worship old gods and not the Holy See, and that's kind of a little small dramatic plot point. To give you an idea, they're trying to make it feel different from the French European world of the Berserk that we know in the Golden Age and try and base it in a more of a Norwegian, Dutch, Viking-esque kind of area. But again, it's not like it is in Vinland Saga with, people wrapped in wool or berserkers. There's nothing like that. Grunbeld is grown up as someone who is of a house, so he is technically a noble, but he isn't treated as such mostly because of his size. He actually gets bullied because of how big he is and how red his hair is. And he goes into a forest and he meets one of the main characters, Benedict, who seems to have some form of elf blood or something. She's very special. She's blind, but she can see colors of your soul. And she can see in Grunbeld that his soul is fire. It's red, just like his hair, and that she mistook him for a dragon. She has these abilities to create this forest, and there's this animal, this big wolf, Ludwig, that she rides. It's pretty cool. It's really cool. It's taking the stuff that's in Elfhelm, like the magical stuff, and introducing it early on. Really nice. Grunbeld thinks it's a dream in his childhood, but later, Tudor armies come and raise his entire town and capture him. His mother is viscerally killed and raped. It's Like I said, this scene that I would describe, not so much on YouTube, probably best it's in a novel. It goes pretty hard. So he is taken and put into a conversion therapy camp with a bunch of other youths so that they can be raised to be just like the people of Tudor. And Grunbild, based on his size, is someone who is very strong to oppose them, so they keep him in chains so he can't move around very freely. And it's just based on his size that he has this immense strength. Think of Guts, very similar. He meets other people, he meets Sigurd and a guy called Edvard, and these become his best friends. Now you're thinking the trio may sound very similar. They kind of are in a way. Grunbild is Guts, Edvard is Griffith, Sigurd is Karska. But the roles are kind of reversed a little bit, but we'll get into that later. Essentially, they go through very traumatic things that happen. They see children killed, tortured. So many children die in this conversion therapy era. And at one point, Grunbild has a chance to save himself from this horrible teacher, Abacassus. The way in which he gives them a chance to maybe redeem themselves after being very bad students, as he likes to call it, he puts them against a massive tiger, which is actually from the Kushan land. It's the big tigers that you'll see in Millennium Falcon arc, right? So they fight this tiger and they succeed. They use their smarts. Edvard, as the planner, is able to create a way so that Grunbild could fight it and actually kill it. At that point, Abacassus gave them a hammer that he knew was way too heavy for any of them to lift, so that they could try to lift it, but end up getting killed and mauled by this tiger. But Grunbild, believing that he is a dragon, like Benedict told him when he was younger, puts all his strength into it so hard that he's able to lift the hammer and kill the tiger. At that time, the rest of his nation's army come and save all the children and chase the Tudors away from that region. Amongst the blood and guts of that tiger, Grunbild sees a little small piece of what he thinks is jewelry, but has facial features plastered all over it. Edvard tells him to keep it as a memento, a keepsake, to remind him that he was able to defeat this monster. And it was inside this monster, and he must have thought, how did it get there? Later he found out it was called a Baelet. And I gotta say, when I read that part, I was getting really gassed up because I thought that was a great way of introducing the Baelet, because what's great about the Baelets is that they find their ways to the one they need to get to through the weirdest, most obscure ways, like the ring in Lord of the Rings, and I've talked about it many times, and I love that aspect of destiny. I love that it got to his hand through the bowels of a tiger that he would later kill. That's just really cool. It's really awesome, and it's a great way to get the story moving forward. Years later, he rises up the ranks in his nation, being adopted again and being trained to be a knight, and he becomes one of the most powerful, and he has his own unit, the Flame Dragon Knights, and he is the Flame Dragon Knight, but he's now a general. He's a very big deal. The king knows who he is, and the king's mistress, who is Edvard's mother, wants to bang him because he's hot. And Sigurd, the childhood friend, has a crush on Grunbild, but Edvard likes Sigurd. Oh no, it's a love triangle. Much later, Grunbild also learns that the man who gives Grunbild a home and teaches him how to be a real warrior is actually the father who adopted a young girl called Benedict, who is blind. They reunite. It's pretty cool. And it becomes this whole love thing where this person loves this person, and this person loves this person, this person loves this person, and there's politics. And it's actually pretty good. It very much reminds me of the Golden Age. It has some political intrigue, it's got some violence, it's got some assassination, it's got some dirty work, a little bit of spice. Through a lot of circumstances that I can't go through, this video will go for at least 40 minutes. Grunbild is put into positions that he himself doesn't want to be in. He wants to be with Benedict because he loves it, he does, but they can't be together because of his status, of her status as a priestess, but she never ever makes an effort to not push him away because she does care for him deeply. And she sees through the people around him that they are people that care for him. But she starts to see in Edvard certain changes. He gets very rash, he gets very angry when certain praises are made towards Grunbild, even though he's just the guy who runs in and obeys the plan that Edvard made. He implements the plan, but Edvard made the plan. And Edvard, being the bastard son of the king, never has a father figure or someone who likes him and praises him. So through a lot of circumstances, especially Edvard's mother wanting to be with Grunbild and sleep with him, he starts to have a very downward spiral ego moment and kills his own mother. Now, this doesn't come out of nowhere. This is slowly built up. It is. And you could see it kind of happening. When it happened, I was like, oh shit, he's the dude who does this. Yeah, he's the guy who betrays him. And it's similar in a way where, you know, Edvard could be seen as the Griffith. He wanted his ambition, but at the same time, he wasn't the one who got the bailet. So Edvard puts in place certain things where he obeys his father, and with his father trying to get his approval, decides to kill Grunbeld. Now, he doesn't want to kill Sigurd because he's in love with her, but again, Sigurd is in love with Grunbeld, and Sigurd is jealous of Benedict, but they're friends. So Grunbeld is put into a lot of different situations. I would say, honestly, out of the entire book, Grunbeld, although being the titular character, I would say makes the least amount of choices and is probably the most boring in terms of what happens to him, at least until the end, which is again the part where it's most interesting. Benedict and Sigurd are much more interesting, I think, in terms of the experiences they go through, the conflict they go through. Eventually, they get to Grunbeld after being chased by Edvard and Edvard's mentality. You see a good window into their mentalities. Edvard admitting he has nothing, so he has nothing to lose to kill his own friends and maybe get new ones. Eventually, Benedict and Sigurd finally get to Grunbeld after he's been trapped by all these enemy armies that have made a deal with the nation just to kill Grunbeld because he's so fucking huge. And Benedict and Sigurd have arrows in their back, and they're not going to live much longer. Grunbeld tries to protect them, but he is trying to fend off cannonballs with his massive fucking armor, and he kind of does, but you know, half his body is fucking destroyed, holding Benedict with arrows in her back. It is very tense, this last scene. It's pretty insane, but remember, there's that bailet. And at that moment when he has the blood flowing onto the bailet, we see the God Hand. Now, this was actually before Griffith became Fento, because when he summons them, it's only 4 of them, which is very interesting. But they already know what it is he might do if he accepts this sacrifice. And they say to him, even though your friends are going to die, sacrifice them and we will give you the power of a dragon. Like he's been told he is. And he says yes because Benedict even said you need to find the White Hawk. Because Benedict, being a priestess, has the power to see certain visions. And at one point in the story, she tries to tell Grunbeld what he needs to do next. And she sees a little bit further into the future. All she could see was this White Hawk and that he is his destiny. Not knowing it was a bad or good omen, she tells him to go follow him. So besides wanting to be someone who follows someone strong and be embroiled in great fights and be a great warrior, regardless of who he's fighting, Grunbeld's motive to go find Griffith is actually kind of poignant because he believes he's a good omen and it's what his beloved told him to do. So with those words, he accepts the sacrifice and the contract and he brands Edvard, Benedict, and Sigurd. Sigurd and Benedict accept their fate, holding each other, being killed by Grunbeld. He absolutely destroys Edvard and he destroys all the armies that were surrounding them at that point. And he decimates half the nation and he destroys the king's castle, everything. It's actually pretty ominous and well written in how it just happens. And in the epilogue, it just talks about how he's walking towards where I assume Midland is, trying to find this White Hawk. And that is essentially where the book ends. And it's, you know, it's a pretty quick read. And I will say this, having read through it and honestly not really thought or looked at any reviews post, this is not a bad novel. It's not. If you want more Berserk, this will get the job done. It will. It gives you a bit more of a world that you feel like may not be fleshed out as much as you want it to, which I know is a criticism, but you know, it's a mild one. But hey, this kind of expands that. That's a good thing. It's got really good art you not have seen before by Kentaro Miura. It's got a cool little Game of Thrones-esque story. Now, Grunbeld feels the most inconsistent, even though he's the titular character, but the other characters kind of make up for that. The other characters are really interesting in what it is they want and what it is that they do and the choices they make. I do feel like Grunbeld, he's kind of there. He's kind of like the filler. He is the filler character who you know isn't going to die, but he makes small changes in battle, which is really cool to read and just immersed in a part of the world that isn't just Guts, Griffith, and Casca, but completely different things. I do think the biggest criticism in terms of it being a Berserk story is that Makoto clearly was like, I'm gonna do my own Golden Age. Which, you know, a lot of manga artists do their own golden age, you know what I mean? They all have their own little backstories they want to give their characters that explain who they are at some point in the manga. But I do think this was way too similar. Every single time I kept thinking of Golden Age. You know, he was trying to create a king that was almost as bad as the King of Midland. There were so many things that just really kept reminding me that this is like Golden Age light, but without less writing and the pacing is much faster. And the novel, even though it's a novel, it reads very quick. Sometimes I'd say it reads too quick. Sometimes you need some moments to like take your time, chill out, you know? At some point near the end, it's like bam, 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 bam. Shit's ramping up crazy. And by the time you get to the end, you're like, oh, that was it. and there was no real moment to let down. Give Grimbeld a moment to think, that was fucked up, but I'm a dragon now. I do think it's a pretty cool piece of Berserk spin-off media. I wouldn't say it's essential. I don't know how much Grimbeld will still be a prominent character in the later chapters. I imagine not much, but it is cool to see that all these apostles have a backstory to what it is. I would have preferred maybe a Zod spin-off. I think that would have made more sense unless they're saving that. But in terms of Grimbeld, it is cool to see a bit more flesh given out to an apostle story. And it feels like the apostle story was much more interesting and genuine than other ones, where he accepted the sacrifice because he knew his loved ones were going to die. And in taking it, he is living with them inside him. He is going to live with their wishes inside him, which is almost kind of a more wholesome apostle acceptance, which is kind of cool. It explains Grimbeld's mentality of fighting, which is cool. It's cool, it is. Now, for a lot of the criticisms that I was trying to find that I already knew about with the novel, it was just people saying, don't read it, it's just crap, right? Because I think you're obviously going to compare it to Miura-san, which, sure, you can. You're free to make that comparison. I think it's not the fairest one. It's a novel. That's a manga. And Makoto, even though being a creative himself, probably doesn't have the extensive experience of this world and the knowledge that Kintaro has. Now, I did a bit of reading on Makoto, and he has made a bunch of different stuff. He's a manga artist, he's a novelist, and he's a TV screenwriter. Now, he's written the screen for Psycho-Pass, School Live, Resident Evil Vendetta, which I don't know if that was good. I don't know, I don't watch Resident Evil. So he's clearly majority of the time a writer, and I kind of want to see what else he can do when he's not beholden to a property that he didn't create. Now, I think one of the biggest criticisms of why people do not like this novel, and maybe are criticisms they give even though they haven't read it, is that Makoto Fukami wrote the screenplay for the Berserk 2016 adaptation. That's a kind of a fair criticism of saying, how could you have worked on this and be good at your job? Listen, there are people who have made incredible pieces of literature, incredible pieces of popular culture and media. Even later in their life, they fuck up. For example, Steven Spielberg created many of the greatest movies of our time, but he also created Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I'm sure there's maybe one dude right now typing, I actually really like that, and here's why Crystal Skull is actually the best Indiana Jones, which, go for it, dude, I can see you typing. But that just shows that there are people who will make great things, and then when they want to make even greater things, they turn out worse. If you're Makoto Fukami and your job is screenwriting, you probably don't really care too much or have any control over animation. So I wouldn't say that's even his fault. A lot of people say he was bad because he also directed episodes. I can't find any documentation that he directed episodes. I can't. I only found that he wrote around 9 episodes of the anime. He didn't direct any episodes, so he didn't manufacture the animation and the style and the shots. He didn't do any of that. He just wrote the screenplay because from what I'm looking in his manga work and all that, he primarily is a screenwriter. So if I had to be someone to criticize Makoto Fukami for writing this book, I'd probably give him very little criticism except what I've just told in this video. Because if I was writing the Berserk screenplay, I probably would have wrote it almost how it was written in terms of it being portrayed just to save time. The only downside is that the animation was so bad that you couldn't help but ignore everything else. There are some problems obviously, there are some problems in the 2016-2017 anime. There just are. Putting in Puck and Isidro into the same group meeting in the first episode. I think these are all creative choices that just had to happen because they didn't want people to have to go through Golden Age again or go through the Black Swordsman again, which is fair. I don't think it's the best way to do it, but I imagine it was used to save time, which can be criticized as lazy or efficient, regardless of how you feel about that. But I do think that he's someone who definitely has a talent at screenwriting. Whenever people talk about Psycho-Pass, people love it. People lord over Psycho-Pass. I think he's clearly done some really good stuff. While this isn't the best novel I've ever read, and I wouldn't even say it's necessary to enjoy Berserk, it was still not a bad read. I'm not upset that I read this. I feel like I've appreciated a little bit more about the other characters or the world building, and you know, kind of see an apostle in a different light, which I think is really cool. And that's probably what the point of it was. You could say it was an easy cash grab, you probably hate it, but me, I don't see anything wrong with it. I honestly don't. I've read worse spin-offs, I've watched worse game tie-ins, I've read the worst shit like that, and this is not one of them, in my opinion. But that's my thoughts. If you've read it or you're interested in reading it, let me know in the comments, or tell me what you think of Makoto in terms of his other work. I'd be interested to hear. I might look into what else he's done. That's all from me, guys. I appreciate if you made it to the end. My name's Mugen. As always, Have a good one.